Great, thank you. So I want to talk about a group of actors that we don't typically associate with journalism. NGOs, so groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Oxfam, are groups that we tend to think of primarily as advocates. They're advocates because we say they're partial. They have a point of view, and that point of view seeks some sort of change. We may recognize that advocates need publicity in order to achieve this change, but we wouldn't claim that publicity constitutes journalism. And we'd make this distinction for a fairly simple reason. Journalism, we say, gives us an account of what's happening. Advocacy, we'd say, tell us how to think about and act upon what's happening. Whatever the merits of dividing journalism from advocacy were in the past, I want to suggest that it's a poor way of understanding the actual work that NGOs do today. The three images you see here point to some of the ways NGOs do things that looked and act a lot like journalism, even as they retain important pieces of being advocacy. So on the left, you see an image of on-the-ground research being conducted in Gazette, Turkey, which is a very small town on the Turkish side of the Syrian border. In the top right, you see video reports showing what they find on these research trips. And in the lower right, you see satellite imagery showing military movements around cities to which neither NGO professionals nor international reporters had access, but through satellite imagery, Amnesty International was capable of showing military presence and military movements. In all three, there is both an account of what's happening and a vision of how to think about these events. They're both, I'm going to suggest, journalism and advocacy. And rather than drawing lines between the two, I'm going to argue that we need to understand the types of journalism that different NGOs do. For people interested in the future of news, there are important implications for thinking about these different roles that NGOs are playing nowadays. If, on the one hand, NGOs do provide credible reporting from locations around the world, then perhaps the future of international reporting isn't quite as bleak as we're often led to believe. On the other hand, if NGOs function primarily as advocates, then there may be cause for concern. Reasonable people espouse different versions of these positions. Just last week, for instance, Dan Gilmore wrote a piece in Slate praising the reporting of NGOs. And somewhat less recently, the Columbia Journalism Review published an essay arguing that NGOs have organizational incentives to, as the author of that piece put it, quote, present as gloomy a picture as possible in order to keep their donations flowing. My own view is that the debate has started precisely where it should end up. That is, we've decided whether or not NGOs producing news is a good thing before we actually have any idea what they're doing. For several years, I've spent time in about a dozen NGOs trying to understand what sorts of news they produce. I've studied their reports and their press releases and their media strategies. And I've also tried to give some, over time, historical sensibility to it. And today, what I want to do is I want to draw on that research to try and understand two things. There are more than two things that we could understand, but I'm just going to articulate two things that we might understand about NGOs as newsmakers. The first thing I want to do is just present historical data to show the marked expansion in reporting capacities at two leading NGOs. These are human rights NGOs, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And the second thing I want to do is to draw on interviews with NGO professionals to show how NGOs balance the demands for reporting, that is, giving an account of what's happening, with advocacy, that is, telling us how to think about what's happening, and how they do this in practice. So this slide offers a number of indicators showing the marked expansion in NGO reporting capacities over time. In an average week, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch each release one or two research reports. They do a lot of other things too, but this is on-the-ground research reporting. The average itself is just under two. To give you a sense of historical contrast, in 1987, for the entire year, Human Rights Watch published 14 reports. In a piece in the New Republic at the time, a journalist referred to that as, quote, prodigiously productive. This year, 2014, Human Rights Watch produced 14 reports in just the months of January and February alone. At the start of the decade in which Amnesty International would go on to win a Nobel Prize, the Amnesty's International Secretariat employed 14 research staffers and reported on upwards of about 100 countries. Today, it has about 125 research staffers and reports on up to 150 countries. Similar increases can be seen at Human Rights Watch. And so the first point to take away is simply that NGOs are providing more reporting from more places with more professionals than they ever did before. Like journalists, NGOs are interested in telling stories. But the stories they tell are not simply accounts of what happened, nor, however, are they simply accounts of how to think about what happened. Instead, NGO reporting is guided by a search for what we might think of as specific types of credible causal stories. And these credible causal stories enable both the production of factual reporting and an account of what to do about it. These stories have three primary components, and I'm going to go through each of the components and try and give a sense of what they are and what they mean. The first is that there must be a credible, verifiable human rights violation. Torture, to take a fairly straightforward example, is expressly prohibited in international human rights law. If a researcher comes across accusations of torture, there needs to be empirical verification of some sort that that violation occurred. And the means for doing this are multiple. All are based on gathering credible evidence. They include, for instance, conducting interviews with multiple victims, asking each to describe the physical setting where the torture occurred so that they can actually verify and cross-check different people's accounts of where they actually were and make sure that they're describing the same thing, that the thing actually happened. Second, there has to be an identifiable violator. NGO researchers must ascertain who committed the violation and, if possible, who ordered those types of violations to occur. And here again, credible evidence is central. Victims, for example, are asked to name their torturers where possible, and individuals identified by multiple interviewees are then seen as violators. And the accused are often asked to respond to the allegations. And so the first two pieces are very importantly factual, empirically verified pieces of reporting. Okay? And they're more than simply witnessing, more than simply, I was there, here's what I found, but I talked to people and here's how I know what I know. And the third piece of the credible causal story is that there has to be a remedy, or there must be some plausible remedy. And this is the advocacy point that follows from the reporting. In cases of torture, the remedy is at least logically straightforward. The torture must be stopped, the violator must be punished. But crucially, the advocacy point can only emerge after and from credible reporting. Now, this is a model of a very particular type of journalism. It's a model of the journalism that NGOs do, and it's not an unproblematic model or one that's above reproach. For example, NGOs have been criticized for privileging some human rights concerns, like torture, over others, like economic, social, and cultural rights, oftentimes for the simple reason that it's much more difficult to actually figure out who's responsible for economic human rights violations, although they do work on it. And as with news organizations, some NGOs are more thorough and more credible than others. And furthermore, NGOs seek publicity not just for this reporting, but for a variety of other purposes, some of which often include fundraising and donations and branding. But NGO journalism is not a model of mere advocacy. In fact, as I've tried to suggest, their advocacy is premised on credible reporting, and this requires as much a commitment of knowing what happened as it does require of you to think about what happened. So in concluding, I would say that NGOs are not a panacea for the challenges facing journalism or for the challenges facing news organizations, but they are a component, and in fact a key component, of the emerging world of international news production. And as such, I think they deserve both our scholarly and our practical attention. Thank you.